Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the Metropolitan Police have said they will consider manslaughter charges over the fire at the Grenfell Tower in West London. The police have confirmed that the fire was caused by a faulty fridge freezer and also say that the cladding on the outside of the building failed fire safety tests. 79 people are missing or presumed dead after the blaze destroyed 150 homes in the Kensington Tower block. Let's have a listen to what one of the lead detectives had to say this morning.
We are looking at every criminal offence from manslaughter onwards. We are looking at every health and safety and fire safety offences, and we are reviewing every investigation, every company at the moment involved in the building and refurbishment of Grenfell Tower.
Okay. Let's get the latest from our reporter Sarah Smith, who's outside Scotland Yard. We just heard there from the lead detective, Sarah Smith. One of the things that has been raised by people affected by the fire is they feel they haven't had yet the true numbers of those affected or even killed. Very difficult at this particular stage. Do you think they will be reassured by what we've now heard from the lead detective?
Well, we heard those numbers again today. 79 known to be dead or missing, presumed dead, only 9 formal identifications. And she was asked specifically about this, about the fact that people are worried there are many, many more. And she didn't really shy away from the fact that she said she feared there would be more, but they have to be extremely careful. They can't go bandying figures around just because there's pressure on them to admit there are more. Like I say, I don't think they've hidden away from the fact. And one of the things she said that they were concerned about was that there would be these hidden victims. She even said the terrible reality is we may never find or identify all those who died in the fire. One of the concerns that there are people who wouldn't naturally get in touch with the authorities, maybe people worried about their immigration status or their subletting or concerned they may be on the wrong side of the law, who don't want to come forward. But she said people need to come forward and say if they know anybody who was living in those blocks, that block, or was visiting at the time, they need to come forward so they can get a realistic they can get some sort of realistic figures, and going through and recovering what's left in the tower block. They said that can take them until at least the end of this year.
What about the range of charges that the police are actually considering now?
Well, they said they're looking at the full range of charges, so they're looking at health and safety violations right up to manslaughter, which takes a much larger burden of proof for the Metropolitan Police. But they're looking at everything. They've seized documents from several premises, although it won't be specific about what those are, what premises there are at the moment. But we know their investigation continues with them looking at all these details. So they were looking at how the fire started, they said this morning, and how it spread so quickly. So started because of this fridge, spread. Well, the fear ever since last week has been, is it because of this cladding? Is it because of the installation? And they've carried out their own preliminary tests on that, and they said that already, even in these small tests that they've carried out, the cladding and the insulation failed, all of them.
Sarah Smith, thank you. Now, the Communities and Local Government Secretary, Sajid Javid, has written to MPs to update them on the government's response to the Grenfell Tower fire. In the letter, he confirmed that 600 buildings had cladding that was being tested, and so far 11 high-rise buildings in 8 local authority areas had been found to have failed those safety tests, including buildings in Camden, Manchester and Plymouth. This is what he had to say in the Commons yesterday afternoon.
I think it's clear that any changes in the wake of this tragedy shouldn't just be technical or to legislation. What happened at Grenfell Tower was that we also showed us all that we need a change in attitude. We all need to rethink our approach to social housing, and we need to reflect on the way that successive governments have engaged with and responded to social tenants. We don't yet know for sure whether this disaster could have been avoided if the people who called Grenfell Tower their home had been listened to. But we do know that for far too long that their voices fell on deaf ears. So if nothing else, Let the legacy of Grenfell be that such voices will never, ever be ignored again.
Sajid Javid there. Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined by Russell Curtis, an architect who works for local authorities. And from Hammersmith, I'm joined by the local Labour MP and Shadow Housing Minister, Andy Slaughter. Welcome to both of you. Andy Slaughter, first of all, what do you think now of the government's reaction and response? Listening there to Sajid Javid, I have the letter that he wrote to MPs. It's very comprehensive. Do you feel reassured now that all action is going to be taken to prevent another Grenfell Tower happening?
Well, the challenges for the government keep growing, and I don't know whether they are up to them. They were very slow in spotting that disaster relief was not happening. That took a week longer than it should have done. We now have the issue of cladding, and there was confused messages on that yesterday. And just this morning, and this is an issue that particularly concerns me, because it was the same issue in the serious tower block fire in Shepherd's Bush last year. We learn it's a faulty electrical goods manufactured by the Whirlpool company, which is the cause of this. And yet, a year on from that Shepherd's Bush fire, we've still not had a product recall of the tumble dryers which caused that, of which 5.5 million were manufactured. These are really serious challenges which the government has known about, and I've seen little sign that they are taking it as seriously as they should. Right,
well, Russell Curtis, let's have a look at the cladding issue, because that has been talked about so much, that could have contributed to the fire spreading and the accelerant. Now, the police say that the Grenfell cladding failed safety tests. Does that imply there wasn't a safety test? In your experience, having worked in the sort of public arena, that there wouldn't have been a safety test done before that sort of cladding was put on a building?
Well, there's a lot of confusion around about what these safety tests involve. Now, the building regulations are, I think it's fairly clear, are out of date, but that's the benchmark that we use as architects and industry professionals to assess the performance of a building against, and that covers all sorts of things. Fire is one of them, thermal performance, all the rest of it. But I think there is a lack of clarity in the building regulations as they stand over performance in particular circumstances like this.
Right. So would you agree with Camden Council, who've taken the action to remove cladding panels that they think are combustible from buildings in their area? Is that the right action to take?
I think it probably is a sensible precaution. I don't think that tall buildings are inherently unsafe, and I'm not necessarily sure I agree with the previous comment about
Andy Slaughter.
Slaughter's comment about why, because obviously that's an issue to look into. But there are fires in tall buildings quite frequently. It's not a rare occurrence. The issue is how quickly that spreads. And I think, you know, if it's a concrete-faced building or brick-faced building, then you just simply don't see the spread of a fire from one dwelling to another. It just doesn't happen because of the way these buildings are designed. As soon as you then wrap an existing building in a new skin, effectively, which these buildings were not intended to receive when they were originally designed in the 60s and 70s, then that becomes a problem.
Right. Well, just to pick up on your earlier point about the fridge freezer, Andy Slaughter, an investigation is being made into that particular model. The business department is looking into that. But to come back, I think if we still got Andy Slaughter, no, it looks as if we might have lost him. So, staying with you, what you said, of course, there are lots of factors that can be contributory, but it does shine a spotlight, though, on fire safety precautions. So, putting the cladding to one side, what about sprinklers and fire extinguishers and fire alarms? I mean, if there are buildings without these sorts of precautions, then are they a risk?
Well, I think one of the problems, as I said earlier, is the reconfiguration of an existing building. Now, big buildings from the 60s and 70s, tower blocks like this, are inherently safe. I mean, because they were designed in that way. I think there's a question over if you take a building like that and then you wrap it in a new cladding to improve thermal performance, acoustic performance, and all that sort of thing. The problem then, are you fundamentally changing the design of that building? And if you do that, should you then be required to install sprinklers and upgraded fire alarm systems and all of that life safety systems? And at the moment, the building regulations doesn't necessarily make it explicit that that's what you must do.
Andy Slaughter, I think we have you back now. The number of buildings that are being looked at right across the country. I mean, we could be talking about thousands of people in tower blocks across the UK. Would you be suggesting that they all be evacuated and rehoused somewhere else while tests are being carried out on the cladding?
Now, look, let's get this into perspective. There is nothing inherently unsafe about either white goods or tower blocks. But if I lived in a tower block that had cladding which was thought to be dangerous, or I had a model of fridge or tumble dryer which had been found to cause fires, I wouldn't feel comfortable. So we do have to take this a lot more seriously. This is a national emergency and disaster, and the particular model of tumble dryer that has caused many fires, but including the very serious tower block fire last year, the advice until a couple of months ago was still that you could continue to use those. The government has a huge amount to answer for. There's been a huge amount of complacency. This is a matter that will be continued to be raised on a daily basis in Parliament until we actually get some action. Right,
but in terms of the action, that's what I'm trying to get from you. Do you think people should be rehoused if they are found, some of the cladding on buildings, on high-rise blocks, to have a combustible element? You can understand people won't feel safe to sleep at night following what happened at Grenfell Tower, but are you saying that they should be evacuated, moved, rehomed elsewhere, right across the country?
I commend exactly the action that councils like Camden and I think Portsmouth and others are taking, which is not waiting for results, but going ahead and making those buildings safe. But you can't rely on this postcode lottery where individual councils, depending on their means and their inclination, do this. Government has to, for every single tower block that we have, has to identify whether there is a risk, and if there is a risk, then that risk has to be made safe. Otherwise, we're going to have other events like Grenfell.
Do you agree with that? Do you think this is now the point at which people should be moved out of their homes because they're worried about what might happen and because they don't know the veracity of the goods that there may be in their tower blocks?
I don't. I think that there obviously needs to be a very rigorous regime of testing. Fires are very complicated things, and there's been a lot of talk about the cladding itself, the actual product, but actually that's only one part of a larger assembly of components. And and I don't think we can. It's healthy to focus on a particular product when maybe that there are different configurations of that which might be perfectly safe, but I think we need to take a rational assessment of it without suddenly panicking and evacuating blocks.
Right, and of course we're looking at private buildings too, who also may have some sort of cladding around their buildings, and they may be high-rise and some of it may be combustible. We don't yet know, of course, whether or not the material was banned or not outright. But if we're talking about the voices of residents in tower blocks, Andy Slaughter, we heard there Sajid Javid said they will never be ignored again in the future. Residents were represented, though, on these sorts of bodies and committees that were in charge of looking after buildings like Grenfell Tower, weren't they?
Look, social housing as a type of tenure and social tenants have been sidelined, and this is a political issue because I've experienced this over 30 years in trying to champion the rights of council and housing association tenants, and that they have been specifically downgraded. We've had no building, we've had estates demolished and sold off. If this is a sea change in Conservative policy towards social tenants, if they're now prepared to build council and housing association houses to relieve the appalling conditions and overcrowding that there is, then I welcome it. It's a pity that it took a disaster like that to make it, but I will believe that when I see it, because for 30 years there's been a studied neglect of this by Conservative governments and councils.
Right. Lucy Thomas, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I think, first of all, as Sajid Javid said, I think, people do have to be listened to. And if you take a step back and look at the number of people who had been saying for a long time, we are not safe, we are not happy, to not have sprinklers, fire extinguishers, to not spend a little bit more money on the slightly more expensive cladding and so on, it just feels like a number of decisions were taken, either to ignore people, to put people to the back of the queue, oh, they're complaining a bit too much, they're a bit too noisy, let's not listen to them. So both in terms of the sort of retrospective respective decisions, but also now, in terms of the government response, are people feeling like they're being looked after properly? Why wasn't the army sent down there straight away, getting things sorted out, people being given provisions and so on? It's just, it feels like it's been pretty chaotic. And I also, unfortunately, Andy, I think some of those in Labour have been very quick to point fingers about what this government has done, but actually there are previous reports and previous lessons that also could have been learnt pre-2010 from also Labour government. So there are lots and lots of questions to be answered.
Matthew, do you agree that actually social housing and the tenants that live in them have been sidelined over decades?
I think they have been to some extent. I want to see the full force of the law used against both contractors and also officials if they're found to be negligent. I think too often people get let off and we turn the other eye. But this is one of those stories, one of those issues where the public actually want the government to actually really use the full force of the law to make sure that people are held accountable.
In terms of the guidelines that you would come under as an architect doing these sorts of public contracts, in your experience, are they, do they have less oversight? Is less money spent? Are they less safe, broadly speaking, in the way that Andy Slaughter has outlined?
I think that I actually think that's very true. I think we've seen a move towards a form of procurement in recent years, where I think people will be very surprised how little involvement architects and other construction professionals have once a project starts on site. And this is a kind of a product of the way in which we procure public buildings these days. And I think it sidelines the construction professionals, but also sidelines the communities, and I think that's a real shame. And this top-down approach to estate regeneration and refurbishment is a tragedy. And actually, what we should be doing is engaging with residents from the outset, engaging with construction professionals such as architects and others to establish exactly what's needed and make sure that those ambitions for each project carry on through until it's finished.
Russell Curtis, Andy Slaughter, thank you both very much.
The cladding and insulation on Grenfell Tower has failed initial fire safety tests, according to the police. They say they're now looking at criminal offences, including manslaughter, and documents and materials have been seized from a number of organisations. At least 79 people are known to be dead or missing after the blaze at the tower block last week. The nationwide hunt for high-rise buildings with flammable cladding continues. The government says 14 buildings across 9 local authorities in England have the potentially dangerous cladding, none in Wales or Scotland. 1 building is being checked in Northern Ireland. Tom Simons reports.
In the first horrifying minutes of the disaster, a resident of Grenfell Tower escapes and looks back at what's unfolding.
Oh my God!
A rapidly spreading inferno, which police today confirmed had its origin in the kitchen of a flat low down in the tower. It began, they said, with a hot point fridge like this one, catching light. Witnesses say flames escaped through the window, where they began to race up and across the outside of the building. Which is why the focus right from the start has been on what was added to the tower during its refurbishment: aluminium cladding and foam insulation. And right from the start, police wanted to know how fire resistant was it.
Preliminary tests on the insulation samples collected from Grenfell Tower showed that they combusted soon after the test started. The initial tests on the cladding tiles also failed the safety tests. Such are our safety concerns on the outcome of those tests. We have shared our data with the Department of Communities and Local Government.
The cladding and insulation simply should not have burnt so quickly. Instead of a fire which devoured the tower, the damage should have been little more than this: a fire in Camden in 2012, a fire contained. So the police tests have thrown up a string of questions. How did it spread? The materials used are under suspicion, but was the design of the refurbishment also to blame? Did the work, completed last year, breach building regulations? And are the laws governing building standards clear enough and tough enough?
This is a criminal investigation. Police are seizing documents from the companies that managed and refurbished Grenfell Tower. And they will consider potential criminal charges, breaches of health and safety, or even corporate manslaughter, though that is difficult to prove.
For several decades now, councils have been putting up cladding to improve the look and insulation of their ageing tower blocks. Now, in what amounts to a crisis for that strategy, some of it's being taken down. In Islington, initially for testing, but next week for good.
I mean, everyone in the block saying, like, you know, if you live in a tower block especially, you're thinking, oh my God, that could have been us. And especially now that they've said it's in our cladding, we're thinking, oh my God. It makes you feel like, it makes you feel quite tearful, actually.
So far, it's affecting high-rise residents in 9 council areas.
All we want is some strong reassurance. There's a lot of, shall we say, stressed people at this present moment in time.
In Wandsworth, where this fire broke out in 2010, 100 tower blocks are to be fitted with sprinklers. But there is grim, unfinished business back at Grenfell Tower. Everyone's been accounted for in this flat, but the police need help to be sure they've identified all the victims. Their message today: if you know someone who was there, for whatever reason, we need to know.
And Tom, the fact that the cladding regulation and insulation failed the police safety test, does this mean that they were in contravention of existing safety regulations, should never have been put up, or that the safety regulations themselves just aren't tough enough?
It's quite possibly the second of those two, Fiona. I think I was quite struck today by the concern shown by the police that the tests that they had commissioned, independent tests in the wake of this fire, had been failed by the cladding and the insulation, the bit behind the cladding applied to the size of this building, especially the insulation. That appears to have burnt very quickly indeed. The cladding should, we understand, have passed a test in 1997 for fire resistance. We've seen the documentation for that, so it should have been able to have been used in buildings like this. But I think the fact that we're now seeing tower after tower failing government tests being carried out right now, again cladding that should have passed previous certification, now failing, shows that there is going to be enormous scrutiny of Britain's or England's building regulations, because they're different in the devolved nations. So I think the whole system is under scrutiny. And also tonight, the NHS has asked its trusts to urgently review the safety of cladding on NHS buildings, hospital buildings around England. So this is not over yet, and I think this has got a long way to run.
Okay, Tom, thank you.
Police are considering manslaughter charges and say the cladding and insulation used around Grenfell Tower both failed fire safety checks. The Met said documents and materials had been seized from a number of organisations involved with the building and refurbishment. It's also been confirmed that the blaze was caused by a faulty fridge freezer. Thousands of people who bought the same model are being urged to contact Hotpoint while rigorous safety checks are carried out. Now, according to the latest figures from the Department of Communities and Local Government, cladding in 14 high-rises has failed a combustibility test. The towers are in 9 local authority areas, including Camden, Manchester, Plymouth, Portsmouth and Hounslow. The locations of the other 4 have not yet been made public. Let's go to our social affairs editor. No, sorry, I beg your pardon. I thought we were going to Jackie Long, but first of all, we're going to our science editor, Tom Clark, who has this report.
Another day since the tragedy at Grenfell Tower. Another high-rise block with the same exterior cladding of the kind that's suspected of feeding the Grenfell fire. This one, Thorn in Salford. 9 identical towers, 850 flats. Today, the council announced all of their cladding would be replaced.
Our building control team have been out to the 9 blocks and have determined that it is aluminium composite cladding. And on that basis, I have taken a decision today to announce that the cladding is to be removed. I'm taking this decision before the testing results come back from central government.
John Smith has looked out on this same view of the estate for 20 years. Like tens of thousands of high-rise residents up and down the country, he can't quite believe the situation he's in.
Totally shocked, considering that they have not yet had the results back, or allegedly not had the results back from the tests. It's going to make a lot of people think, was that a material tested before it even went into the blocks? If it wasn't tested, then who's responsible for not testing it?
Salford Council told us it was taking a proactive decision to remove cladding, but wasn't in a position to comment on further details. For concerned residents wanting answers, today the news got a bit more complicated. So-called rain screen cladding systems are made up of two distinct layers, an outer waterproof layer and beneath that a thick layer of insulation. Today, London's Met Police announced that lab tests had shown both materials used on Grenfell Tower were combustible, the insulation more so than the outer cladding. We obtained a sheet of the same insulation used on Grenfell Tower and took it to this fire testing lab. It's called Celotex RS5000 and it's certified for use on high-rise buildings. This machine exposes it to 700-degree heat, similar to an established fire. On its foil surface, it doesn't burn. But then we tested the material on its edge, the orientation it would be exposed to in a high-rise fire. Oh my goodness, that's already caught fire.
That's maybe 2 seconds.
For comparison, we then heated a sample of mineral wool insulation, also used as exterior cladding. No flames. High-rise building regulations clearly state non-combustible materials should be used wherever possible. So, based on our demonstration here today, this insulation, which is exactly the same as the one used on Grenfell Tower, clearly burns. Yet its manufacturer says it's conducted the very rigorous tests needed to prove that this meets the high-rise fire regulations in the UK. So how can that be the case? Well, one thing the Grenfell Tower fire has thrown into sharp relief is there's a major problem with our building fire regulations.
Building regulations aren't fit for purpose, they're convoluted and they give you the wrong answers. Making buildings safe, all it takes is the will and to draft proper legislation through the building regulations. We can do it, but you've got to listen to the people who do not have the vested interest.
This afternoon, Celotex Saint-Gobain, which makes the RS5000 insulation we tested, said it would stop supplying the material for high-rise buildings with immediate effect.
Tom Clark. Well, our social affairs editor Jackie Long is in North Kensington now, where she's been following today's events. What's the latest on the police investigation?
Well, this is now the subject of a massive police investigation being run by Homicide Command. As you said earlier, they are considering charges including manslaughter and serious breaches of fire regulations. Now, what the police told us today is that they carried out early tests, not just on the cladding, but on the insulation that Tom's been talking about, and both failed on safety grounds. Now, we know that teams have been from the bottom to the top of the 24-storey building. They are carrying out fingertip searches, and one of the main focuses of their investigation, of course, will be trying to get victims back to their families. But the police said today there was a terrible reality that some of the dead would never be identified and that the recovery operation would not be complete by the end of the year.
In the early days, they dared to hope. Now friends of Bhakti Haftum and her 12-year-old son Biruk seem to accept the worst. They gathered tonight to remember a mother and son described as beautiful people. Just two of the victims of a fire which wreaked carnage in the 24-storey tower and in the lives of hundreds of people. Police confirmed it started in a fridge freezer like this one, the Hotpoint FF175BP. The government have announced an immediate investigation into the model. The manufacturers, Whirlpool, expressed their sorrow and said they're working with investigators. The police reiterated today this is a criminal investigation. They're considering charges including manslaughter as well as breaches of legislation and fire safety. Early tests on cladding and the insulation both failed on safety grounds. The insulation combusted soon after the test began. Police also revealed they've seized material and documents from a number of companies and organisations. The evidence being uncovered gives some detail of the appalling nature of what happened here. Police say more than 600 emergency calls were made that night, some lasting over an hour. The vast majority, people inside the flats. desperate to get out. More than a week on, and the number of people confirmed dead and officially identified stands at just 9. The number missing, presumed dead, remains unchanged at 79. But these figures are a source of real anguish and anger here. Many families simply don't believe them, and they don't understand why the police don't release a much higher death toll. Police admitted they're struggling to confirm who was living in the flats, but hoped assurances that no one's immigration status will be investigated would bring new information. The families and the survivors simply do not believe the figures you're releasing about the dead and the missing, and they think you are trying to hide the scale of this tragedy. What would you say to those families?
We are working through a number of other lists that we've been given by various organisations to ensure that we've captured every figure that we can. We've worked with the Home Office to get the assurances that we will not use this to check immigration status, because I really want to ensure we've got those.
You understand the distress and anger that it's causing the families, and
absolutely
they're coming up with numbers of their own.
This is painstaking work that is going on 24/7 at the moment. I fear that there are more. I do not know who they are at the moment, and that is why I am really pleading with the public to please call us.
Police say specialist teams are working in extremely distressing conditions, doing what they can to return victims to their families. But they acknowledge, because of the ferocity of the fire, they may never be able to identify everyone who died, and that the recovery operation may still not be complete by the end of this year. And that's devastating for Ahmed Chalat. He lost 5 relatives on the 21st floor. He says he and his family are struggling to cope.
Words cannot explain it, because they live in on an hour, on a minute to hear any news, but they don't, because nobody's coming and telling them this is what's going on.
And the news today that it may take so long.
That's just put salt into the wound. Clearly, it's not good news at all. It's not good news.
As the vigil continues here tonight, it's likely there'll be many more, remembering the dead who may never be buried. Well, yesterday, the chief executive of Kensington and Chelsea Borough Council resigned, albeit reluctantly, and tonight, the Labour group on that council have called on the council leader, Nick Paget-Brown, and the cabinet to follow suit. The Conservative-controlled council, the Conservatives have dominated for years here. The Labour council group say they now want the council leader to step down. There's no response on that yet, but this story, of course, will continue.